Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Amanda Pierce-Kelly with NAC, of course, and we are excited to share with you the latest updates on policy and advocacy. There's a lot going on in Washington, and the impacts for House centers individually and as a program are very significant, and there are some specific steps that we want to run through with you all in terms of advocacy that you can engage in the next few weeks to push us across a finish line, the finish line, I hope. So before we dive in on the content of the webinar, I do want to go through some just housekeeping and logistics. For those of you that have joined us each month in a wonderful, committed way, you already know that the way that we provide audio for the webinars is by computer. We do this so that we can have as many people as possible join us for the webinar, so hopefully you're already hearing us, but for those of you who are having trouble with the audio, the best way to do that is to come in through your computer. So these are just easy instructions to do that. As always, the webinar is going to be recorded today, and we make that available to folks in a couple different ways. We always post it on the HC Advocacy website. You can find that under past events. We also will push it out as a part of the Washington update, so look for that sometime next week. Typically it takes us anywhere from 24 to about 72 hours to access the recording and to correspond with the slides, but both will be available. As soon as that happens, we will put it up and make sure that you all can see it. Oops, looks like our slides are, not sure if the slides are advancing. But, okay, love technology. This is always good. I'm going to see if we can switch the host ball over to John so that we can advance the slides. So Alex and Eliza, if you guys can switch that over to John. Perfect. All right, now we're on the audio slide. So, again, and now we're on the webinar is being recorded slide. Sorry to reiterate, guys, but just look for the information. We're going to get that out and available to folks as soon as possible. We put it out in a couple different places. If you have questions in the meantime, you can always be in touch with us, but we'll get that up quickly. Last piece, if you have questions or comments or concerns at any point throughout the webinar, the best way to talk with us is by using the chat box. You can go ahead and enter your questions in there at any time, and we're going to take up questions probably at the end of the conversation unless there's something really pressing and pertinent, in which case we'll do our best to take it live. But again, if you have questions or comments or need more information, that is the best way to be in touch with us throughout the webinar. And then just a last piece here, if for some reason you have a question and we're not able to take it during the webinar, the great thing about this system is that it allows us to follow up with you after we wrap up. So if you're shy, of course, like some of us, go ahead and enter your information there and we can follow up with you offline too. All right, so with that, there's a lot to cover today, and things are moving very quickly and at the same time very slowly in Washington, I guess is what I would say. I'm happy to be joined by our Federal Affairs team, the Advocacy team, and really the whole Public Policy and Research Division is at hand to make sure you guys have all the information. But we want to walk you through the latest updates in terms of what's happening in Washington and what we can expect over the course of the next few weeks, as much as we can anticipate. And then, of course, we want to walk through sort of what you can do as advocates and what the action steps are, like I said, to kind of push us closer and eventually over that finish line to be done with the cliff, at least once and for all. So I am going to turn the mic over to my colleague, John Sawyer, to get us started on where we are and just run through the basics.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to everyone who took the time to join the call today. I think where we stand, we'll get into kind of the current state of play in the Congress, but I think all of us are feeling very energized, very motivated, very excited to once and for all have this cliff fight behind us, at least for this year. We have some steps to go in order to get to that place, but I think we feel confident that with all the advocacy of all the folks on the phone and all the folks around the country, we're going to get there. It is going to be a complicated month, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which the timeline and the interconnected issues and all of the different pieces have implications for health centers, but let's, I think bottom line, it will definitely be a December to remember. But let's go back a little bit as we do on most of these webinars. It's always important to have a kind of a firm grounding in what we're talking about here when we talk about the funding cliff, which of all the issues that we're focused on right now, and there are many, this is absolutely priority one given the urgency with which it's taking place. So just as a quick reminder, prior to the Affordable Care Act, the Health Centers program was funded entirely out of what are called annual appropriations, the regular process that Congress goes through to fund most government programs. In 2010, with the ACA, a special fund was created that dedicated 5 years of increased funding specifically for the purpose of growing health centers. And with that funding and the extension, health centers today serve about 8 million to 10 million more people than they did pre-ACA. So that funding has really gone toward not only new sites, but expanded services, expanded capacity at existing health centers. This fund was in addition to that regular annual funding, which is marked in the blue on the chart there. And as we say, every new access point award, every new service expansion quality award, capital grant, the base adjustments, all of the new funding that health centers have had over the past really now 7 years has come out of this funding. In 2015, when we faced the first funding cliff, health center advocates were successful in getting that funding extended for 2 years. And that extension, which is marked in the orange on this chart, actually expired, that funding technically expired on September 30th of this year. So if there is not an extension moving forward, the program would have to continue operating with about 30% of the total amount of funding that it has in the current year. Let's talk about a little bit about what that means on the ground for health centers today. I think the first and most important takeaway is that the lack of congressional action to extend funding even after the deadline has really just led to enormous uncertainty for our entire system of care. All 1,400 health centers across the country, the 27 million patients that they serve, are, whether they're directly or just indirectly affected, are affected by this uncertainty. What we know is as a result of congressional action, starting on January 1, HRSA plans to begin dispersing health center funds on a month-to-month basis with no new funding awards until the funding runs out. And I think some health centers who have January 1 start dates have really already started to hear about this. This is really different than in a normal year. For those of you who don't live and breathe the grant cycles, which is most of us, in a normal year, health centers have access to their entire full year of funding when they start their budget period. Because this has not been addressed as yet, they're having to put these major restrictions on grant funding and really dole it out month to month, after which there is a certain point at which there just simply will be no funding left if Congress doesn't act. More indirectly, not related directly to the grant, but health centers have reported to us that they're experiencing financing issues, securing credit, issues around recruitment, especially of clinical staff, purchasing equipment, et cetera. And so there is currently really a disruptive effect. We have heard about at least a small handful of site closures given the enormous uncertainty, not only in the federal funding arena, but in state and local policy as well. The National Health Service Corps, which is in the same position as is the Teaching Health Centers program, already experiencing some disruptions there too. So we talk sometimes about what is the indirect effect or the direct effect. Direct meaning what is the actual impact on your grants. What is the indirect effect being what is the impact of that uncertainty. There is actually, in fact, a new impact study that is out just in the last week from George Washington University, really looking at that long-term direct effect if Congress were to just simply never act to fix the cliff, which again, we don't expect, but if there were no action whatsoever, what the impact would be. And they look not only at the impact on jobs at health centers, but really cumulative economic impact, jobs not just at the health centers, but at the local businesses where the health center employees shop and service providers to the health centers. Really significant losses and significant economic retraction, and we don't need to tell you that. You're sitting on the ground, you know exactly what is faced in your community if these funds don't come through. So that is why, in concert with our incredible advocacy network across the country, we have spent most of this year on what you can see here is a long and winding path to really both build the support and build the legislative imperative that Congress take action. And so we won't go through every step here, but going all the way back really to the beginning of the year, even before April, health center advocates started coming to DC. We started really rallying members of Congress in support of an extension of funding. That culminated, I would say, most recently with the biggest action being passage of a 2-year funding extension as part of a piece of legislation called the Championing Healthy Kids Act, which passed through the House November 3rd. And that piece of legislation, as I said, contained a 2-year extension for health centers, a 2-year extension of funding for teaching health centers and the National Health Service Corps, an even longer-term extension for the Children's Health Insurance Program, 2 years of delay for so-called Medicaid DISH payments to hospitals. So a number of the different healthcare issues that all really are facing, already have faced or are facing at the end of the calendar year expiration. And collectively, all of these issues are really referred to as what people call the health extenders. That legislation passed the House by and large on a party line vote. Almost all Republican members of the House, the majority, voted for the legislation. Most Democratic members in the minority voted against it, and that was not because of disagreement over the content of the extensions. It was because of disagreement over some of the ways that the bill chose to pay for those extensions. And so coming out of that House passage, what we have seen over the last month or so is for most of this conversation, frankly, to go behind closed doors. What has been going on is negotiations at the leadership level, House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, that being really senior staff from Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, and Paul Ryan's offices, sitting down to see if they can work this out, the larger package of health extenders, of which really when you total them all up, there's more than 12.5 things just on the health extenders list. What we are experiencing now, I think, is what you see in this cartoon, which is really the mentality of Congress that even when they pass a technical funding deadline, they feel comfortable waiting until there is absolutely an imminent effect in the field, or until they're about to head off for a holiday recess or another recess to take final action. We saw this similar thing play out, and we're continuing to see it play out with some of the disaster relief funding. The first disaster relief funding bill that passed after the first 2 hurricanes in Florida and Texas was literally the week that FEMA was simply just out of money. They waited until there were simply no dollars left at FEMA in order to act. And so part of what we're up against here, the good news is we're not up against a enemy who says we don't want community health centers to be fully funded. There is broad bipartisan support for that extension. The bad news is what we're up against is a very crowded calendar and a more dysfunctional than usual Congress, and a lot of issues are getting connected. So let's talk about that a little bit. This is probably not the extensive, but pretty close to extensive list of the things that Congress has said that they need to get done this month. The first thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is that they need to avert a government shutdown this week. The current appropriation keeping most of government programs open is on what's called a continuing resolution, sort of an autopilot plan. up until this Friday, December 8th. We'll talk about that in a moment because that presents us one of the first opportunities to try and get a cliff fix done. Obviously, we've talked about the need to extend the healthcare programs, including health centers, CHIP, National Health Service Corps, et cetera. Many of you have read about, and we'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation, the tax reform effort. I think it's fair to say that on both sides, whether it's in support or in opposition, the tax reform conversation and debate has really been the thing that has taken up most of the bandwidth over the last month. It remains the highest priority for Republican leaders in both House and Senate, and in some ways has really held up action on some of these other issues. The only other couple that I'll mention here is there is a process underway to renegotiate and probably raise what are called the budget caps, and those caps apply to all appropriated funding. They were set back in 2011, and when we come up on a year like this year where there's not a deal to raise those caps, both sides really agree that something needs to be done to lift those caps. Those apply to both defense spending and domestic spending, and so there's a lot of back and forth going on right now about how much will that be raised. Will it be raised by the same amount on defense and domestic, et cetera. So you can see beyond that there are significant other things, the DACA provisions, the immigration deal that folks are really pursuing, tax reform, the Murray-Alexander market stabilization legislation, disaster spending, as I mentioned, and we've been discussing that here in D.C. a little bit, given the impact on health centers, especially in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We also have a nominee for a new HHS secretary, Alex Azar, who is going through his hearing and confirmation process during all of this. So I can say that in my 15 years of working in D.C., this is the longest and most complicated to-do list I think that we've seen. I think the good news is, at least from the perspective of health centers, those top issues, the health center funding, CHIP funding, other extenders, what we hear is that major progress has been made in those negotiations, and at least on the substance, those issues are further along than some of the other issues on this list. However, the metaphor we came up with is it's a little bit like Russian dolls. You have to open one in order to get to the next, in order to get to the next, in order to get to the next. And one thing you hear a lot right now from folks on the Hill is even if they have made progress on something like extending the health center funding cliff or averting the cliff, nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to. And so the good news, as we said, is that there has been progress on health centers and on that broader package of healthcare extenders, but I think there is reluctance on both sides to move forward on the health pieces without that budget agreement that I mentioned on the caps, and there's reluctance on the budget agreement to move ahead until there's a tax bill in place, or that's either gone forward or it's died, and on and on and on. And so I think that, what we're up against here is, again, not opposition to health centers. It's not even opposition necessarily to a package of healthcare extenders getting passed. It is the complicated interplay between all these different issues. And I think one thing that I think Amanda will stress, and that we certainly believe, is that from an advocacy perspective, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about what the budget cap deal is or how the tax reform bill plays out in relation to X, Y, or Z. What we need to keep up is the pressure simply around fixing the health center funding cliff. That's where we're advocates. That's where we're focused. And I think, I only share this not because you have to extend or understand all the interplay. Frankly, no one does. I share it because I want you to understand kind of the playing field that we're on right now. And in fact, be ready for some of the arguments that you might hear back from the Hill about, well, we're totally agreed on X, but we have to wait for Y and Z. I don't think we should be accepting that as advocates, and we can talk more about that. So just to go back a little bit to the timeline, folks who've been on the webinar with us every month will remember we've had multi-month timelines in the past. This week we are focused on the month of December because we really feel like an imperative has to be created and has been created, that this has to take place. A long-term fix of the health center funding cliff, multi-year fix, has to take place before the end of the year, especially given all the impacts on grants that we talked about on the earlier slide. So as we mentioned, this Friday, government funding expires at midnight. We expect, and the Congress is beginning to work on this now, a short-term continuing resolution to basically buy themselves another 2 weeks. The plan as of now seems to be that that short-term continuing resolution would be relatively clean. In other words, there wouldn't be a lot of things attached to it. The one thing we do expect to be attached to it, or we're hearing right now, is a patch provision for the CHIP program. For those who've been following the CHIP debate, you know that many states are starting to run out of funds given the passage of the deadline. What this provision would do is make funding that's already there at the CHIP program at CMS available to certain states only for the month of December. And when that provision went in, we got a number of calls from the Hill trying to reassure us that, you know, while there's a patch for CHIP, that doesn't mean they're separating CHIP from health centers. It doesn't mean they're not committed, and in fact got a lot of assurances that they're committed to getting this done by the end of the year. Assurances don't keep the lights on and don't pay the bills, and so that's why the advocacy really needs to stay ramped up. But I did want to know, we've gotten some questions about that CHIP patch. The truth is HRSA has the funding to continue funding health centers through this month. In CHIP, they do not have access to that funding, and so that's really the difference. That being said, that 2-week CR that we expect this Friday is generally what people expect. I can say with some certainty that that is not at all clear that it has the votes to pass. It's not at all clear that nothing else will be attached to it. A lot of that we expect more clarity on coming out of, frankly, a meeting 24 hours before that deadline between congressional leaders and the president, which is set for Thursday. And so those of you who've been following the advocacy alerts know that we have been pushing really hard to try and get a cliff fix attached to this first continuing resolution this year. That is because of how much is, well, first of all, it's because we're already 2+ months past the deadline, and we need to push for action on the first available vehicle. Secondly, it's because of how much else needs to be figured out by the end of the year and how messy we anticipate that getting. So we continue to push that this be on attached to the continuing resolution this Friday. If that's not the case, we will have an all-out push that it be attached to the last train leaving, which is likely to be another continuing resolution just before Christmas. And I just want to make a note, when we talk about attaching a cliff fix to a continuing resolution, it's important to note that even if a continuing resolution for appropriations is just 2 weeks or if it's a month, we're not saying only extend health center funding for 2 weeks or a month. They can, and we expect that they eventually will, attach a long-term health center fix, multiple years, at least the 2 years that were in the House, to even a short-term continuing resolution. And I know that gets complicated, but I think the important thing to take away is even if all government funding or broader government funding is only on a several weeks at a time basis, that there's nothing preventing Congress from attaching a longer-term fix. So I think, as we said, that's what we currently expect as far as the plan, that there are 2 bites at the apple. We continue to push to be on that first package that's going this week. If that does not happen, there will be an all-out push to be on the last package that is passing through Congress before the end of the year, which we currently expect to be around December 22nd. If Congress does not pass that first appropriations, that first continuing resolution by this Friday night at midnight, we'll experience what we have experienced a number of times over the last couple of decades, in the form of a federal government shutdown. And in general, as you can see here, a shutdown happens if Congress doesn't pass those appropriations bills or extend them through a continuing resolution. What is important to know is that health center operations will continue in the event of a shutdown. We do expect there would be some strain on HRSA capacity because they would have fewer staff, so you would potentially have slower responses to communications with HRSA, to things like change in scope requests. But those of you who have already had your notice of grant award and been awarded your funds will continue to be able to draw down funds even in the event of a government shutdown. The administration has discretion to apply that shutdown to agencies as it sees fit. So it can designate certain agencies like the courts, Social Security, and some at HHS as really essential employees going forward. But I think the important thing to know is even if there is a government shutdown, if we were betting, I would say we would not expect that this week. But even if there is, health centers can continue to draw down grant funds and should be planning to continue to operate throughout that period. Before we move on to the advocacy piece, because as we mentioned, this is really sort of like the issue that is looming over everything right now, we did want to give a quick snapshot, and a quick snapshot is pretty insufficient to a really complicated piece of legislation, but of the tax legislation that has been moving through the Congress. So where we stand right now is that both the House and the Senate have passed their versions of tax reform, tax cut legislation. That is one step further than legislation got earlier this year to repeal and replace the ACA. If you remember, the House did pass that legislation. The Senate was not able to get together and pass ACA repeal legislation. So in process-wise, this tax bill is already further along than the ACA repeal was. You can see here some of the numbers just as a reminder of what the margins are. These are bills that are passing with only support from Republicans right now. There are significant differences between the two bills, and Oliver Spurgeon on our staff has really kind of become our part-time expert on the tax bill, and so if there are specific questions you have on some of those provisions, feel free to reach out to Oliver directly or to federalaffairs@nac.org, and we can talk through some of the specifics. I think one of the biggest pieces of interest and biggest pieces of concern in particular comes in the Senate bill, which would, in addition to the big tax changes, also repeal the individual mandate that was included in the Affordable Care Act. And part of the reason that they did that in the tax legislation is the mandate is unpopular, especially among the Republican Party. But the second reason is repealing the mandate actually generates revenue that they use to spend on other tax provisions. And so that, we believe, and the Congressional Budget Office has estimated, will have a really significant impact on the ACA markets, on the individual marketplace. The estimate is that 13 million fewer people would have coverage as a result of a mandate repeal, largely because either they wouldn't feel compelled to purchase coverage, or coverage as a result of that destabilization of the marketplace would become unaffordable. They expect significant rise in premiums, and so there have been several other pieces of legislation introduced throughout the year to really try and bring stability to the individual market in the ACA, the most prominent being the Alexander Murray legislation to continue making what are called cost-sharing reduction payments. The important thing to know there is all of those pieces of legislation that were premised on ways to stabilize the market, all of those presumed that the mandate would still be in effect. And so the cumulative effect of all of this without the ACA individual mandate, even if you pass some of those other stabilization measures, is still really negative. There are also a lot of other changes that health centers really want to be aware of. We're finalizing a blog post on this. There are a lot of other resources on this as well, but there are impact on tax provisions that health centers have used to access capital, some of them listed here, as well as the New Markets Tax Credit. There is what's the so-called Johnson Amendment, which talks about political activity by nonprofits. We are advocating, alongside most other nonprofits, that nonprofits continue to have a hard line between their tax-exempt status and their ability to undertake political activity. But there's a lot going on in this tax bill. We are monitoring that very, very closely, not only for its own implications, but for the implications it has for moving anything else before the end of the year. So I just want to remind folks what has happened so far this year. There is so much activity that has been undertaken. There's so much advocacy that has happened. And what we have seen, I think, is an incredible response from across the healthcare sector, from across Capitol Hill. We continue to see social media posts by prominent members of Congress about the need to extend health center funding. We saw last week the National Governors Association weigh in on behalf of the need to extend health center funding, something they've almost never done before, because as all of you know, health center funding goes directly from the federal government to the local government, or sorry, to the local entity, and governors don't necessarily get a piece of that. But health centers are so important to them, and shout out to our friends in Massachusetts, whose Governor Baker really led the charge on that letter, that they really included the health center priority in there. Your state associations, and those of you who work for state associations, have been doing an amazing job really rallying all your state's health centers to letters to the Senate to really get this on the radar. I can tell you that going into that Thursday negotiation between the leaders and the president, there has been a public statement, at least by Leader Pelosi and Leader Schumer, specifically mentioning that they will be pushing for an extension of health center funding in that meeting. So we are at the highest levels. We are on everyone's radar. We are, as I said, getting a lot of attempted reassurance that this will be done before the end of the year. But this is crunch time, and it's really the time to step it up, to tap those sort of deep wells and reserves of energy, and to keep weighing in until this is fixed, because it's going to take all of us to get it over the finish line. So I will pause there and hand it over to Amanda to really talk in a little bit more specifics about how we can do that.
All right. Well, apropos, I think, actually I'm going to go back before we dive in on the advocacy. I do want folks to see this, and it's the slide that we've been using. I think that the one thing to bear in mind, as frustrating as it is to be on Congress's timeline, to be candid, the great news is that we do have support, and we're not fighting to justify why a fix needs to happen or why our model is sound and effective and all of the things we know it to be. There's actually great consensus, and we are one program, we remain one program where there is good agreement, bipartisan agreement. Many others do not have that, and so it's not lip service to say that we are going to get there, but I think the thing that is still in question is the timeline and what the final outcome and package will look like. And that's where our advocacy becomes so important, because what's going to produce a shorter timeline for action is our applying pressure to Congress in such a way that they feel they really have to move and that they can't afford to wait until the 11th or the 13th hour as it is. So that is a good segue into the next piece here. Oops, let me just... There we go. Now the slides are moving. So what can you do? I think right off the bat, staying informed, I think without question, the updates and the information that John just shared should signal to you that things are not just moving quickly and changing and evolving constantly. There's just a lot going on. There are a lot of moving pieces. And so staying informed is one of the best ways for you to be effective in your advocacy. Advocacy is going to require action. I don't think that, sometimes I think that's an obvious one, but just to have the information and to see the alert is not enough. We really are counting and depending on folks to actually act when we ask you to do so. And I think the last piece there, and we've been talking about this since we passed the deadline for the first time, and that is that we just have to stay committed to fighting until this is done. And again, I go back to that frustration. I have a great deal of frustration about operating on somebody else's timeline, but it is the reality we live in, and so the best thing that we can do and the most control we can have is to just stay committed and keep going. So this is a slide. The message is simple and unchanged, and you'll see that this is a consistent slide in every single presentation that we do. The reason that we have chosen not to change it is that I hope this provides a little bit of reassurance, and that is to say that you guys know how to do this. You know what the message is. You know the process even at this point. You should, inside and out. But again, even with all of these things moving and even with all of these evolutions, nothing's really changed in terms of our advocacy, in terms of why we're doing this and how we're going to get this done. And so telling the story, talking about the people, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later, reminding Congress of the urgency, all of the same things that we've been doing. It may feel like a broken record, but there's actually a purpose and a method to that. And again, the one thing that I would say is that I hope that that actually makes people feel more comfortable and compelled to act and engage in this, because hopefully it's muscle memory at this point, quite frankly. I think the trick, again, is to hold Congress accountable at this point as they continue to stretch that deadline, and that's a good move into the next slide here. So in terms of what folks can do right now, we did send an action alert earlier this week asking for folks to contact their members of Congress to request them to take immediate action to fix the cliff. But to be clear that, you know, we want that to happen in the first available legislative vehicle. And John just walked through. We've got one opportunity coming up at the end of this week, and we've got another one before the end of the year. And I think stressing that, you know, and frankly making them aware of the fact that we know that there's only a couple of bites at the apple before the end of the year to get this done. And when we say we want immediate action, we're talking about one of those two options. I think the other thing to build off of what we've been doing, and where I want to kind of give folks permission, if you haven't already, is to hold your folks accountable, to push back and be a little demanding, not just a little demanding, I think very demanding at this point. I think respect is first and foremost, must be where you start. I think you should express appreciation, and by and large, there isn't anyone that doesn't support us, and so I think you start there by saying thank you for their support and their commitment. But I think it's very appropriate, timely, and important to ask some tough questions and really hold their feet to the fire. Why has this not been included, or why have we not seen specific language explaining how you're going to extend our funding in this upcoming CR or in the next package? If they give you an answer, which I'm sure they will, because congressional staff and members of Congress themselves are very talented at providing an answer regardless of whether they actually have the information or not. But when you receive an answer, I think, again, part of the stage that we're at now is pushing back and not simply accepting that answer. I think it's asking them to give you specifics around what they are doing and the actions that they themselves are taking to ensure that this is being included before the end of the year. And then I think it is asking, again, for that commitment, but also getting back to you with the information that they're receiving. I think it's really pushing them to continue to have conversations with congressional leadership. We hear daily that that's one of the most effective and impactful ways. If your member of Congress doesn't happen to sit on a committee of jurisdiction or doesn't happen to be a member of congressional leadership, that's the best avenue for them to take personally. They should certainly be committing to having those conversations, and some of that accountability goes back to following up with them and saying, well, what did you find out? What can you tell me about what is being done to get this included as part of one of these two packages? So again, I think the information piece, you know, staying informed, we'll go back to that, but I think it is also giving yourself the permission and getting comfortable with the fact that it's okay to push back. It is okay to be demanding. It is okay to hold them accountable, and in fact, we have to do that at this stage. So this is a super simple slide, but I just want to reiterate something. There are three, in this case, there are a lot of words actually that I think are very relevant, but I think there are three words right now that are very applicable and to hold in your mind as you're having these conversations and as you're considering how you're going to engage. There's nothing more important right now than persistence. And I would say when we talk about persistence, we're also talking about remembering that you're not bothering them, that simply because they've expressed support or commitment to see this through does not mean that you can count on them to do that. Do I question for 1 minute that they, you know, when the rubber meets the road, that they're going to vote in favor of supporting us? Yes, I do believe that, where they've said, you know, explicitly that they support us and that there's a commitment. But there's absolutely, especially right now with so many things going on, an out of sight, out of mind. And if they are not hearing from you, it's very easy for them to simply put it in the stack that they're not squarely focused on. And so persistence right now is hugely important until this is finished. And I think it's even more important because of how many things are on the table and all of the moving pieces. So please, even if you've heard over and over and over again that your folks support you, that is not a reason not to follow up with them and continue the outreach and continue to urge for action and put pressure on them, explain to them what's happening for each day that they hold this over. The accountability piece is what we just walked through, which is to say it's not enough for them to simply say, I'm supportive, I'm committed to seeing this through. You know, this, for some of you who may have been at the Community Health Institute way back in August, that's what this is. It's the same message that we started with, which is talk is cheap. I need to know what you're going to do. And when you say you're going to do it, you better believe that I'm going to follow up with you. And so when we talk about accountability, it is going back. And there we go to the persistence again. It is making that commitment to say, okay, I have this commitment from my member of Congress and or their staff. I'm going to give them approximately maybe a day or two at this point, given the timeline, and I'm going to go back and say, what's the progress? What more can you tell me? And keep doing it until you get the results that we need. And collectively, if we can all do that, we will get them to take action far more quickly than if we leave it to them to figure out when the timeline's going to end. And the last piece with this is people, is remembering that all of this impacts real people, our patients, our staff. So I'm not prepared to wait around for Congress to get to it when they deem it's time to get to it in the 11th or the 13th hour, because the impact on people is real, and we know that. And while doors are not going to close on January 1st, the implications are real even today. And I don't think we can afford to gamble, nor do I think it should be appropriate for Congress to continue to gamble when there are so many people that stand to be impacted by this. So I just encourage you to think of it in this level of simplicity, that these are the three things that hopefully is going to help you in guiding your advocacy and reminding you why it's important to continue this outreach and really urge and pressure and hold them accountable for taking action to get this done. In terms of other items that you can be focused on right now in terms of your advocacy, things you can do right now, we have been pushing a sort of recommitment or a recommitment to making sure that you are committed to acting until this is done. And so we've been using Fight Till It's Fixed. This is still a really important message to send. I think it helps motivate each other and keep the momentum going across the network. If you've taken action and you just want to do something else to spread the word about, boy, we need as many voices and we need as many advocates as we can in this fight, this is another easy, simple way to stay engaged. We have some really wonderful social media tools. I think it's, at this point, I think it's really about singing it loud and proud that we will stay committed to fighting until it's fixed, until Congress gets this done. So if you haven't had a chance yet, please go and take a look. It's under hcadvocacy.org, spread the word. And there's, as I said, some really great tools up there to demonstrate all of the wonderful action you're taking to support this and getting the cliff fixed. So in terms of what you can expect for the next few weeks, and we stopped short of really laying out a specific plan and timeline for calls to action, primarily because it's hard to determine when we are going to need to really turn up the heat. And what that means is you should be prepared for many calls to action over the next few weeks. There's going to be a lot of twists and turns. You heard it already from John that things are evolving very quickly. One thing is always connected to another, and that will often lead to very short notice where we are requesting you to take action. And so just stay on your toes. Know that December is going to be demanding and maybe a little turbulent, but I think the outcome is going to be very positive as long as we can continue to keep the volume high and the pressure up. And again, I think the best way to make sure that we accomplish all of those things is by staying informed, having a plan. I think this is bigger than any one individual advocate. It really requires an army of folks from back home. So hopefully the entire health center staff and board and as many patients and members of the community as you can muster that are committed to taking action each and every time, because it's going to be repetitive. And part of that is to make sure that there's an unmistakable message being received. And part of it, again, is to apply the pressure necessary to really make Congress feel the burn of choosing to prolong this any further. Resources, we have worked really hard at trying to develop as many resources and supporting documents to help you with your advocacy. They are all located under hcadvocacy.org, Make the Case. If you haven't taken a look at that anytime recently, there's a plethora of options for things that you can do beyond just these two simple action steps right now. We also will provide any updated talking points, information about what happens after the cliff, which has been there for a while. But I think the other thing is if you do have questions or you need additional resources, you can always email us at grassroots@nac.com for more information or to talk with us about items that you may need that we have not yet put together. So I think we're going to kind of end here with just a very obvious statement that the only way we're going to get this done is with advocacy. We know that. And so when we talk about volume and pressure, we have been in the place of needing to be loud to raise the profile of not just the health center funding cliff, but I think the profile of our advocacy network and the power we hold as a network in getting things done. And so this is going to require an all-out for the remainder of the year for sure until this is finished. I do want to leave you with one hopefully compelling and motivating graphic. What you guys see in front of you right now is a measurement of the program funding, health center funding, and the growth of our advocacy network. And you can see that the lines that represent our funding and the number of advocates climb at a very similar peak. And what you can deduce from that is that the impact of advocacy is very real. This is not made up. This is truth. This is data. This is actual information that we can pull out of many different sources. And so when we talk about how much you play a role in getting this done and driving the outcome in the future of the program, the proof is in the pudding. And we should be very proud of what you see in front of you right now, both in terms of the growth of the network, but also in terms of the growth in our funding. It's you that has brought us to the point that we are at now, and it is you who will bring us forward to the next part of our funding future. So we are very close, closer than we've ever been. I know we will get this done. We have the support, but we really have to keep it up, keep the pressure high in order to see the results that I know everyone wants to see, not just in terms of getting it done, but in the shape that we want it to take. So I will stop there, and I think it is time for questions. Alex, do we have any questions from participants?
Yeah, we have quite a few questions, and just a quick reminder to folks to use your chat box to type in your question. We'll try to get as far as we can through those today, but worst case, we'll try to follow up with you individually if you have something we don't get to. So we have a few questions about the different health center grant cycles and the timeline for how this will have a direct impact on the ground for health centers. So can somebody explain a little bit about the bullet point about this impacting 235 organizations at the beginning of 2018, and specifically why this isn't affecting every health center right away?
I'll start, and then we have Colleen Myman from our regulatory affairs staff here to give a little bit more of that nitty-gritty detail. But I think the short answer is because each health center is funded on a 12-month grant cycle, and without getting too far into the details of that, because folks were funded at different points initially, each of those grant cycles starts in a different month. And none of the grant cycles start in October, November, or December. So the first grant cycles for where next year's money will be spent are those grant cycles that start in January. And then, Colleen, do you want to talk a little bit about the number and anything else?
Sure. Out of roughly 1,400 grantees, 235 of them, or about 1/6, their grant cycles, their annual budget period starts January 1st. And at this point, with the amount of funding that HRSA has available, they have enough money to fund those grantees through the end of February. So normally you would get your NOA, your Notice of Award, the beginning of December for a January 1st start date, and it would have 12 months worth of funding. This year, because of the ongoing nature situation with the cliff, there's just going to be 2 months worth of funding. So the expectation would be when Congress finally gets around to getting this done, those health centers will get an additional NOA that will provide them with the remaining 10 months of funding. But at this point, that's all that HRSA has to give.
All right. Thank you, guys. So we have a couple of questions sort of about those health centers with spring start dates for their grant renewal. Somebody here is saying, are you saying there's only $1.5 billion going forward and that a program that comes up for renewal, say in the spring, may not get any money under 330 if the 1.5 runs out by then? And they have a disclaimer that they will not stop their advocacy regardless.
Thank you. Yeah. That is very important. Okay. HRSA has given out 2 sets of numbers in terms of how long the funding is going to go. Given the amount of funding that exists right now, which, as you may recall, runs out on Friday, there is enough money for the January starts and the February starts to be funded through February 28th. But as of March 1st, there will be no new funding either for the January, February, or the new March starts. Assuming that Congress gets the appropriations for the year, that's our $1.5 billion appropriated funds done, then there should be enough money to run through around the end of April. So it will be in May that the funds would start totally running out. But we are confident that by then, by hook or by crook, we won't actually have to deal with this because we will have gotten the mandatory funding taken care of.
And all I'll say, I think, in addition to that, is to remember that the $1.5 billion, the discretionary funding, right now they don't have that whole $1.5 billion either. Yeah. They have it in piecemeal because that is moving according to the timeline of the continuing resolution. So it's exactly the right question. I think our caution in getting that far ahead is that we do not want to give the impression to Capitol Hill that somehow health centers are fine through April or through February. That's why we've been really focused on the impact now and the impact of the uncertainty now and the impact for the January starts. But I think, HRSA is doing what they can do to stretch very limited resources that they have as far as they can stretch them. But there does come a hard stop point at which there will simply be no more funding for grantees after if the cliff is not addressed.
Great, thank you both. So speaking of the CR, can you discuss and elaborate a little bit more about why our mandatory funding and the health center cliff hasn't been fixed or addressed in the CR so far? What do you think the response from Congress is likely to be, and how should advocates respond to that messaging?
I have a couple of things, but I will also turn it over to Amanda in order to talk about the response. I think that, unfortunately, some of it goes back to that congressional mindset of I cannot tell you the number of times that we on our team in federal affairs have been in meetings this year where we've talked about the October 1st deadline and the fact that the funding expires October 1st, and we get the question, and honestly they use these words, what is the drop-dead date? And we typically will say, I'd rather you used a different phrase when we're talking about people's lives, you know, and then we focus on the fact of the impact. Even though there is not a grant impact until the first of the year, the impact is being felt now. And so, again, I think that we are up against significant dysfunction. We are up against an environment where even the most bipartisan priorities like health centers, like children's health insurance, are caught up in larger partisan fights, whether it's fights over how those extensions are paid for, whether it's fights over we don't want to move this until we have agreement on that. You know, I think it goes back to that deadline mindset. I think it goes back to the interconnectedness of all of that. And what I want to say and what I know Amanda will say is you should not accept that as a good enough answer from your members of Congress. This is their responsibility. They have abdicated that responsibility so far. This is why we are still pushing for something on Friday, even though Friday is 2 days away, because they don't even have the meeting with the president until tomorrow. So nothing is decided yet. We have to continue pushing, I think, even when it's uphill, because if we don't get it Friday, what we need from them is assurances that it will be done on the next one. And many people have already gotten that message back. But that's why, you know, we would be not doing our job as advocates if we didn't continue to push that this be addressed on the next possible vehicle, especially when we're, you know, now 9 weeks past the expiration date.
So I think John's answer is spot on, but I don't have to go up to the Hill every day, so my answer is going to be a little different in terms of as your national advocacy director. And to be blunt, I think we've reached the point where we have to be blunt. I think it's time to get angry. I think that Congress has been given permission and let off the hook over and over and over again because they have been making this claim of support and they have been expressing commitment to get this done, and yet they haven't gotten it done. And so I think, you know, do we need to be respectful? Yes, always. But there is a way to be tactful in your anger and in not just expressing the frustration, the disappointment, and holding them accountable. But I think, you know, I often hear from advocates reluctance to push back or trepidations about, well, what am I really calling about, because they are supportive and they've said they're going to get this done and we don't have an anchor to latch this onto. Well, here's the thing. They're not producing the anchor, and that's what we need. And so the only way that we're going to get this done, and it is now down to the wire in terms of the end of the year, the only way that we're going to get that done is to really push them and ask for tough answers and say, that's not good enough. That is not good enough. You have been saying the same thing to me for months, and I have not seen action. And not only have I not seen action, I have not been given a specific plan for how you will get this done. So what is it? And keep asking that question until they give you an answer. And do not let them sidestep and say, oh, well, you know, the House has to do this, or that we have to deal with the budget caps first. Too bad. You know what? You've known about these things, Congress. You knew that these things were coming. Some of it might be brand new, but frankly, that's irrelevant. You've got 2 bites of the apple to get this done. I want to know how you're doing that. And I want a commitment, and I will keep calling until I see it's done. So you can hear in my voice the frustration and the anger and the disgust, quite frankly, with just the lip service. But where we have to take accountability is that we've allowed them to do that in good faith. And I think we have to continue to have good faith, but we have to hold them accountable and put their feet to the fire a little bit and say, nope, it's not that easy. I'm not going to accept that answer because fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And so now we're at that point. And so just give yourself permission to get a little angry and express that frustration and see how they respond.
One more quick footnote to that, which I couldn't agree with more. The thing to not allow is for them to point the finger anywhere else. And you will hear, I think, in reactions from rank and file members of Congress, well, this is, you know, either we're in the House and the Senate is where they haven't acted, or, you know, we're pointing at this other piece of legislation that needs to be done first, the way Amanda said, or, you know, this is really at the leadership level and, you know, we don't have an influence over that, or I'm in, you know, the Republican Party and it's the Democrats who are holding this up, or I'm in the Democratic Party and it's the Republicans who are holding this up. At this point in this Congress, the margins are so close that one member can have a significant impact on whether something gets done. That is especially true in the Senate, but it is absolutely true in the House also. The other thing that is really important to acknowledge about this moment is they will need votes from both sides of the aisle in order to get this done. And so I know a lot of folks throughout the year, especially on the ACA debate, which was moving ahead really on with one party, have said, I have a Democratic member of Congress, they support me, they, you know, what can they do? They've done everything they can do. Well, on this one, they haven't. No one has. Until there is a vote on the floor to get this done, no one has done enough. And that's not to say that people haven't done a lot. They have, but we need them to continue making noise about this. We need them to continue putting this at the top of the list until we get there, and that applies to every single one of the 535 members of Congress.
Awesome. Thank you all. So we're getting a couple of like what if questions. People kind of starting to have a little bit less faith in Congress and their ability to act, and some worry about us getting closer and closer to the end of this calendar year. Is there any thing that you guys have to share with health centers about the need to plan for any cuts to funding, the need to be thinking sort of long-term about any interruptions in our funding, and any sort of concerns also with Congress funding us at a lower level?
So I'm going to start, and then I think John and perhaps Colleen might have suggestions as well. But I think here's the thing. I think everyone here in Washington and every congressional office that I'm aware of really does express commitment and intention to get this done. I think going back to what I said before, where we are is when they get it done and what it looks like. And I think we want more control over both of those things. And so just to bear that in mind, to put folks at ease that A, the doors are not going to shut on January 1st. And so, you know, we're on life support, but I am cautiously confident that it will be done. But what I would say is, if you don't have a contingency plan, that's very unwise. And it's not just unwise because of the current situation we find ourselves in. Unfortunately, we're living in an environment where I just don't think it's responsible not to have a contingency plan for any imaginable change. I mean, I think that you have to be in a position to plan for pretty much any scenario at this point. The cliff certainly is putting us in a position where, you know, you're having to figure out what would this look like, and I think that that's wise. Whether or not it's a plan that you actually end up having to deploy, hopefully not. But not to have a plan, I think, is dangerous and irresponsible. So that's the non-policy answer. That's the non-sort of nitty-gritty of what we can expect in terms of long-term picture and funding. I think that that's just good practice in terms of operation management.
I agree with that, and I think that, you know, one thing that happens when we get more up close to some of these decisions and some of these questions over funding, over Medicaid, over 340B, over workforce programs, when we get up close to how these decisions actually get made, one thing I think we realize, and we deal with this all the time, is how fragile all of those pieces are that come together to form the system of care that we have. And yet, even despite that fragility, you know, it's easily argued that we have more support and broader support and deeper support, you know, than almost any other, at least healthcare system or healthcare provider type in the country. And so sometimes it's really hard to reconcile those things, but I think the way to do that, as Amanda said, is through contingency planning, through, you know, really contemplating all these different scenarios, having plans in place, and then really channeling that planning into your advocacy. And so, you know, if you at the CEO level can go in and have a conversation with your member of Congress and says, this is my contingency plan, these are the sites I would have to, you know, consider closing. These are the positions I would have to consider eliminating. I don't want to do that, you don't want to do that, but, you know, I'm a responsible executive. I have a board that I answer to, and in order to do this responsibly, I have to have that plan. Please help me not have to put that plan in place, right? Please help me not have to close sites or, you know, lay off staff. I know that folks are concerned about getting people worried, but I think what people mostly worry about is not feeling like there's any plan whatsoever. And so I think that, you know, these are serious issues. They are fragile. They're not fragile because we have a strong enemy. They're fragile because we're up against a dysfunctional system right now on which we're relying for a lot of support. And I think that's just where we continue to come out, is we are strong when we are together, but the underlying pieces of this are fragile because of the system that we have, and so you got to have all of those plans in place.
I would just add, too, that, you know, there's all of the things that John just described in terms of staffing and sites and existing operations, but I think the other story to tell is, and you all know this better than anyone because your hands are on the community, is to speak to the unmet need. And the plans that you have and the intention and the goals and the mission that you have to fulfill caring for the existing massive unmet need in your communities and across the country, and looking your congressman in the face and saying, we want to get there. Never mind my existing operation, which is, you know, potentially going to be harmed, but that says nothing of what's left, of all the things we still have to do, which we are planning for constantly, which we're trying to find creative ways to address and care for, and just say, you know, what do you want me to do about that? You know, so I think there's two sides to the story. They're both, unfortunately, not particularly bright, but I think being able to speak to not just what's happening with the operations now, but I think the good that you can be doing beyond your existing operations. And in cases where maybe you've already come up with the backup plan and you've found a way to work it out to keep everything intact as it exists, but that still doesn't address the fact that there's some other place that you need to go. And I know I haven't talked to a single health center ever in the 13 years that I've been talking with them where they haven't been able to rip off 4 to 5 things that they want to do next because they've identified spaces in their community and in their patient base where they have to go because they see that there's a need. So I think it's speaking to that as well, just as equally and in a balanced way to what the impacts could be to the existing operation.
Great, thank you both. So moving a little bit further down the list of questions, and we have a question here about the Champion Act. Can you provide a little bit more information about why there was not agreement with both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, on the Champion Act?
Sure. So at the end of the day, it was called the Championing Healthy Kids Act that passed the House. Again, it was not a disagreement over the content of the policies and the extensions for us and CHIP and the other things. It had to do with some of the ways those things were paid for. So several of the pay-fors, as they're sort of referred to here in D.C., provisions were controversial. One of the ways that was paid for was with reductions in future funding for what's called the Public Health Prevention and Public Health Fund. That fund supports a significant chunk of the annual budget of the CDC and supports prevention, wellness, and public health activities. There were also changes to how higher income Medicare beneficiaries would pay. They would have to pay a larger share of their premiums, in fact, 100% share of Medicare premiums for folks making over $500,000 a year. And then there were changes to the way the grace period for which enrollees in qualified health plans or marketplace plans currently have 3 months to pay their premium before they risk losing their coverage. This provision would have shortened that grace period to 1 month, which had a lot of concern from Democrats, especially given the impact that would have on people's coverage. So I think that going into that bill, there were negotiations to try and find bipartisan agreement on the offsets or the pay-fors. They were not able to do that in the House, and that's why it passed with, by and large, a party line vote. There were about 15 Democrats who did support the bill. But I think they have continued at that, again, at the leadership level since passage of the House bill to try and find that agreement. Everything we've heard is that there is progress being made and a recognition that you will need bipartisan support for these offsets going forward. But again, we haven't seen that. So that's why we really need to continue to push.
Excellent. And then it looks like a couple of people have been reading about CHIP funding and hearing that there's some talk about only extending CHIP funding for a year or two because of lack of revenue sources. So can you talk to this point at all and how that might impact our chances for health center funding?
Sure. I think I would just address this in the context of a lot of different rumors that we're hearing. So when we hit moments like this on Capitol Hill, where frankly decisions are being made in a very small room by a very small number of people, and yet offices do not want to sound like they're out of the loop and do not want to sound like they don't know what's going on, that is fertile ground for rumors. And I don't want to discount for a second the possibility that if, we get to crunch time and there's not significant agreement on how things are paid for or on revenue sources, that this bill could begin to be scaled back to a shorter amount of years, potentially to smaller amounts of dollars. But I can say with some certainty that that is not something that we have heard on our team. I think as with any rumor or piece of information that you're hearing from Capitol Hill, we always say there is no piece of information that you're hearing from Congress that's too small to share with our team, to check with our team, to see if you can get validated. And I know I speak for our whole team when I say a lot of our week this week has been dialoguing with our members, with health center folks around the country about, hey, I heard this, hey, I heard that. In some cases we can say definitively that's not the case. In a lot of cases we can go and follow up with some of the people who are in that very small room and say, hey, we're concerned about this. So I think it's all just an argument for don't believe everything you hear, especially at this kind of moment, but err on the side of sharing that with us so that we can chase those rumors down. That's part of what we're here to do.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a couple of questions here about the tax bill. Can you talk a little bit first about the PAYGO rules and the tax bill implications for Medicare and entitlement reform particularly?
Sure, I'm excited about our wonk on the phone, but no, this is a real issue and an important issue. So the tax bill actually adds to the deficit and in substantial numbers, so about $1.5 trillion over 10 years. And when a bill adds to the deficit but does not have a way to pay for that, there's a provision called PAYGO, which is short for pay as you go, and that requires essentially across-the-board cuts to other programs to go into effect in order to basically take care of, to make up for that increase in the deficit. And there are a lot of different rules around how that works. There are programs that are protected, so they're held to only a certain percentage of cuts. Health centers are one of those programs that is held by and large to 2% reduction. But I think the bigger thing that we understand, and there's a lot on this today, and Oliver, maybe you can speak to this, is it is very likely that even if they pass the tax bill, they are likely to basically waive these rules. Is that right?
Right. So what John was referring to was called the PAYGO scorecard. And so every year, the Senate wipes this scorecard of debt clean in order to avoid an infraction of this PAYGO rule. And so instead of having large cuts across the board, they take one final vote that wipes the PAYGO scorecard clean, that is all the accrued debt from the year, so that cuts to Medicare and CHCs and all of these other vital programs do not happen. And so it's widely expected. Representative Mark Meadows, who's the chair of the House Freedom Caucus, has also said that he does not expect the PAYGO cuts to go into effect this year. And so it's widely expected that there will be a vote attached to whatever long-term funding vehicle happens at the end of the year that will also wipe this PAYGO scorecard clean to avoid these cuts to Medicare and CHCs and so many of our vital health care and safety net programs.
Great, thank you. And are there any specific implications on the tax bill for health center funding specifically?
I would say that there are not specific implications for funding in the sense of Section 330 funding or grant funding. I would say that, as we mentioned, there are a handful of provisions, and we'll have a more detailed post posted about this soon, that we do believe impact health centers. And one example is many health centers have utilized what are called new markets tax credits, a really successful program that is designed to spur economic development in underserved communities. Health centers have used those over the years to help finance capital deals and building projects. The House tax bill would eliminate the new markets tax credit program. The Senate bill would not. And there are, a number of other provisions like that. There are also provisions, I think, really affecting charitable giving and changes to the standard deduction that, could have an impact on people's willingness to do charitable giving. So more to come on that, but I think it is something that we're monitoring closely. And then obviously the overall impact on the deficit is of concern because, the more that there are increases in the deficit, the more it puts larger safety net programs, entitlement programs, and other programs like Medicare, Medicaid, the ACA under threat for future cuts.
Great, and speaking of some of that a little bit more, specifically on the Johnson Amendment, we've just got a request for more information about it and potential impacts on political activity. So I think, as John said, we'll be providing some more information here before too long, but is there anything else you all wanted to clarify on the webinar today?
I think as far as the Johnson Amendment, and again, I will leave it to John and Oliver to sort of speak to where things will land in process, but I think in so much as it could potentially change the way in which nonprofits engage in political activity, regardless of the outcome, it will never be a best practice to engage in partisan political activity as a nonprofit. So in the one way, it really wouldn't change and should not change anything for how we conduct ourselves in the advocacy space. It is not a good idea, and depending on the outcome of things, we will certainly make sure to either have a webinar and speak to this left, right, and center to discuss the outcomes, but I think I cannot emphasize enough that part of the reason we have such strong bipartisan support is because, in fact, we are nonpartisan. And when you start picking sides and when you start engaging in political partisan activities, you open yourself up to a litany of things, whether legal or not, in the immediate and the long term. And so for an individual organization, that is the case. And the other piece that I would say is that one choice, one organization that chooses to go in a particular direction can potentially have an impact on an entire program. So on this one in particular, I will say that it will be very, very important, regardless of the outcome, if something were to change, that we all link arms as a network of health centers to continue to maintain a completely nonpartisan stance as an organization and as a network.
Awesome, thank you. And it looks like I think this is the last question, although, folks, just a quick reminder, we have a few more minutes, so you can go ahead and put more questions in the chat box. But a great advocacy question here. What recommendations do you have or strategies to just better engage communities in calling for a fix to the self-centered funding cliff?
I think it's a great question. There's an endless number of answers, and I don't want to take up the entire, I mean, that's its own webinar, quite frankly, but I think if you have not yet had a conversation with your community partners about the ripple effect and what it would look like should something change at the health center and what's really at stake, and everything from the services being provided and how many people, all of the different corners of the community that you're touching and how that might change. But I think it's also, there's an economic implication. You know, I think there are a lot of communities where the health center is the largest employer. And if something changes with the operation or their financial solvency, what does that look like in terms of employment and then additional needs perhaps from those in the community for support services that they were not trying to leverage before. But I think beyond that, there's a lot of dollars being invested into our communities through our health centers. And so I think as you're having these conversations, making that connection, I think certainly doing an inventory to figure out where there are cross-sections with your community partners and folks that you're working with presently. And I think that it's the same activity that we encourage when you're talking with elected officials, which is to say, what is meaningful to them? And then framing the conversation around that to compel them to engage and to act. Health centers have, again, I can't think of a single health center I've ever spoken with that doesn't have just an enormously long list of folks in the community that appreciate and adore the work that they're doing. And so I think if you have not yet, just ask them the question, can you please help us with this? This is what's at stake, and do that basic education. I would be hard-pressed to believe that you'd get a no. You know, I think the way in which they may choose to support you will take different shapes, but I think at this stage, if everybody did something, we're going to be a heck of a lot better off. And I also think it sets the stage to a lot of really wonderful and rich work going forward. And so sometimes I think it's just a matter of asking a question that you have not historically asked. So I would start there, but we have we have a lot of really wonderful resources to support folks in this space about how to effectively leverage community partners. And beyond that, I think for folks that want to get deeper into this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly at grassroots@nac.com. Happy to set up a call and direct you to those resources, but I think also it's not a one-size-fits-all. You know, I think that's the beauty of it, is that you can kind of tailor a plan to engage those folks in a way that's going to be meaningful in your community. But the trick is to ask the question, I think, right off the bat.
Great, thank you all. So I think that covers the bulk of our questions. So any final words of wisdom or advice?
You know what, I'm really proud of how far we've come. I think we've done a tremendous job, and the fact that we have more or less universal support and quote-unquote commitment to get this done speaks to the advocacy that's already happened. And I think, you know, you've heard us say it over and over again, that there is confidence and real belief that it will get done. I think where we want to have control and exert pressure is the timeline in which that occurs and the shape that it takes. And we can do that. Everybody that's participating today in our network, our full network of health center advocates, is what's going to get that done. So just a big thank you for all the work that's occurred up to now, and stick with us. You know, we've got a few more weeks in this year. It's going to be, you know, a wild ride, as it has been really for the past year, so to speak, but there's nobody better or more up for the task than I think our network and certainly the team at NAC. So please rely on us if you have questions. We really appreciate always hearing from everyone, and we're going to get this done. A few more weeks, we'll see where we're at, but hopefully we'll be celebrating. So those are my final words. I don't know if John or Jana actually have anything else to add.
No, I think you said it. I just think we got to keep up the energy all month, and we got to fight till this is fixed. I think we're close. I think an enormous amount of groundwork has been laid, and it's just about getting us over the finish line. But we really need everybody to recommit now to really continue and go back to Amanda's principles of persistence, accountability and people.
That sounds good. And happy holidays, everyone. Hanukkah coming up and Christmas, and hopefully we're going to have a whole lot to celebrate.
Hopefully we can send Congress home.
Yes.
Right before Christmas.
You guys can do
that. A big thanks to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Be in touch with any questions, and we will certainly be in touch with you soon. Thanks a lot.